Welcome to Cross Party Lines, episode 2. It's a podcast designed to unpack New Zealand politics so that you don't have to. Thank you to all those that have listened to our first episode and joined the community on our social pages. I can't speak for Chris or Phil, but for me personally, the response was overwhelming and mostly positive as well, which was amazing. Have you guys received any feedback from anyone?
Well, I got 1,000 likes on my Facebook page. The comments were largely positive, but there's always some grouchy old bastard out there, a bit like me, that wants to have a crack. But that's politics.
Exactly. You've got to
People
put up
people
with
like
them.
my irrelevant anecdotes, so I'll try and provide a few more this week.
I like that. And speaking of things that you need to make sure you do, as well as Chris's irrelevant anecdotes, the listeners out there need to remember to follow the podcast on their favorite podcast app, and that will ensure they get updated every Tuesday with a brand new episode. Today, though, actually on episode 2, we're going to have 2 episodes in the feed, and that's because we've got a bonus one coming up. Chris, do you just want to really briefly explain what the other episode today is going to be about?
Yeah, well, Tuesday, 11 November 1975 was a huge day in Australian politics, and it's when Goff was fired by John Kerr. I remember it very well because I was canvassing for the National Party for Bill Young in Strathmore, and a very nice Labour couple invited me in for a cup of tea, and we talked about the dismissal that had just occurred. They were happy because they'd kept a National Party canvasser off the street for 30 minutes. I was happy because I wasn't canvassing for 30 minutes. And so we discussed the finer points of constitutional law. I'd initially said to them, no, that's not possible. You can't do that. But there we go. And so I think there are some important lessons which it would be good to discuss later in the program.
Yeah, there we go. We'll be talking constitutional coups in the bonus episode in your feed later on today. But in the meantime, let's get into the main episode. We're going to be talking about the potential move-on laws for our homeless population, the changes to the Climate Change Response Act that were announced last week, and also we're going to be looking at the Democratic wave in the gubernatorial and mayoral races or mayoral race in America last week. Phil, you were mayor of our biggest city and you know people just want safer streets, which, to be honest, I think the three of us can agree is a fair enough request. Do you want to maybe explain what was proposed last week by Minister Paul Goldsmith in terms of the move on laws?
Yeah, well, it sort of slipped out, didn't it? It seemed to be the product of a leak and caught the government slightly off guard, and they were a wee bit coy about whether they would own up to it and admit it. And then they said, look, it would be a move on power, but only if we had somewhere to move people on to. Now, yes, if we're moving people off the street and into proper, secure, safe accommodation, every one of us would agree with that. If, however, it's just a cosmetic thing, we want these scruffy people, which is the term used by Mayor Brown, out of sight and out of mind, and we don't care where they go, then that's a different story. I think we have to do something about it. I think that some of the complaints are valid complaints. Shopkeepers that, come in the morning and that somebody may have urinated on the doorway, people that might get abused by somebody that's clearly mentally ill on the street, or drunk or drug affected. But we already have a solution. What we don't have are the resources to back up that solution. The solution is called Housing First, and it's a scheme that I came across down in Hamilton, actually, before I became mayor, and was a very keen advocate of it in my time of being mayor. Housing First says the problem that many of the rough sleepers face are that they are suffering from a mental illness or from substance addiction, whether drugs or alcohol. You can't fix that while you're on the street. Therefore, we need to find a home first, but that by itself is not enough. We have to have wraparound services, which means that we can deal with the problem that led them to being on the street. And Housing First is remarkably effective. It's housed over a couple of thousand people, and people tend to stay in their accommodation. These are people that do have serious problems, normally might not last in proper accommodation, but because of the wraparound service do. That's the line we should be following and promoting, because it is a stain on, it's a blemish on our city that we have people rough sleeping, dying young, living a horrible life of being cold and often hungry, and being insecure because they're vulnerable to attack from other people, sometimes suffering from the same problems that they have.
And Chris, is this an attempt to actually solve a problem here, or a genuine attempt to solve a problem, or is this just good retail politics for a national party looking at an election in 2026?
Well, I think probably there's a lot of retail politics in it. I go back to first principles, and we all have individual rights that are recognised in the Bill of Rights Act, but there are also community rights. And I think this is a question where community rights have to prevail, and the right to be able to walk safely down Queen Street. If I've been to the Auckland Philharmonic, I should be able to get back to the Pullman without having to step over 15, 20 people. But I don't disagree with what Phil said in terms of the wraparound support. I think there are people out there who opt out of society and leave their families and live that lifestyle because they're seriously sick and they need our help. And I don't think it's enough to say the government should help. There are a lot of wealthy people in Auckland, many of whom I acknowledge worked very closely with former Court of Appeal Judge Lynn Stevens to raise money, and they did a fabulous job for the Auckland mission, but more is required. So you can't simply say it's the council's problem, it's the government's problem. It's our problem because these people are our neighbours, they're fellow human beings, and we should be looking after them. So I think there are a lot of wealthy people in Auckland, and if they want their major thoroughfare, Queen Street, to be one of the great streets of New Zealand in our flagship city, they're going to have to contribute a little bit more to ensure that there are facilities like the Auckland Mission provides and those wraparound services that Phil talked about. But I emphasize it's not the government's responsibility, it's the responsibility of you and me, because these people, as I say, are our brothers and sisters.
Yeah,
I sound like a revivalist preacher, but I think that's the reality of the matter.
No, it is a reality, and let's give a call out to the Auckland City Mission, and it is supported by some. We used to have annual fundraising dinners that we'd have some of the chief executives working along with professional chefs providing the dinner, making donations. We raised $100 million to create Home Ground, which now has a detox centre. It provides accommodation, long-term accommodation for 80 people, half of which were formerly rough sleepers. They help run the James Liston Hostel that provides another 50 beds. Council did a lot. During COVID, we actually got all but 20 people, 20 rough sleepers off the streets of Auckland, finding them alternative accommodation. And for those that were still there, we used the council cafeteria to provide hot meals for them during that terrible period when everything was closed down. So, look, we can make a difference. Most people want to be helped. There are a few that don't. Some, a minority has become a lifestyle for. There was one guy, I used to go out sometimes with the council security people early in the morning when we'd wake up the people that were rough sleeping in doorways and just say, good morning. Hey, time to get up and move on because you'll be blocking this doorway. And they knew everybody by name. And they'd point out one particular person and said, look, that person we actually found accommodation for a fortnight ago, but he'd been on the streets so long that he only lasted a couple of weeks in conventional housing. But he was the exception, not the norm. We did the 1 year, once a year, thank God it was only once a year, where we did the sleep out at night, sleeping on cardboard on the street. I hated that. It was uncomfortable. The night was long. It was cold and sometimes wet. And I can tell you, look, nobody voluntarily wants to live like that, being cold, hungry, and insecure. Most people, if we can provide the assistance, will accept that assistance. If we do it in the right way, we could solve the problem. We'll go a long way towards it.
But be under no illusion if we don't do it right. I was talking to Greg O'Connor, my local MP, this morning. He and I frequent the same cafe for a coffee. And he said to me that if we simply remove people from Courtney Place. Sorry to talk about a place other than Auckland, but they do exist, believe it or not.
And we love them here on this podcast, Chris.
Yeah,
We love
of course you do. Of course you do. But if we move them from Courtney Place, they will end up in Newlands. They'll end up in the suburbs. And there's already the start of a problem in the suburbs, some of the suburbs of Wellington. So it's all hands to the tiller to make sure that these people are looked after, because if we simply move them on, they'll pop up somewhere else.
And that's been seen in Auckland as well. I was, not to bring it back to Auckland, but I was talking on Thursday night last week with someone who works for the Cairo Business Association, but his house is in Torbay. And he said since the emergency housing in Auckland City has been reduced and the places for them to be have been reduced, he is noticing people that he used to see on K Road now in Torbay. So there is a shift.
Let's not pretend that the problem is mainly in the CBD. It's not. We went out in 2018, did a point-of-time count of the homeless, and I was allocated Mangere. And finding people in doorways in the Mangere town centre, sleeping in cars in the car parks, you don't solve the problem simply by moving them out of sight, out of mind of the Queen Street retailers. That makes life a bit easier for them and for people walking down Queen Street, but it doesn't solve the problem. It transfers the problem. And just one other point on that, if we talk about threat, the violence and the serious crimes that occur aren't by the homeless in Queen Street or in Fort Street. They're the young guys that come in, get tanked up at a nightclub and go out looking for a brawl. So if you're looking at it from a law and order perspective, then those are the people that you'd be targeting, not the homeless. They are not generally the people that are around and about and assaulting others. Some have, if they're mentally ill, there's that danger. But generally, the real violence is coming from a different source.
But we've got to move on it, because I think everyone knows what happens when you are too indulgent, and that is you create a city like San Francisco. I first went to San Francisco 40 years ago, fell in love with Union Square. You had Macy's, Neiman Marcus, Brooks Brothers, my favorite haunt, Johnston and Murphy. They're all gone now, and it looks like Gotham City. It's destroyed. And so we've really got to do something about it, because that jewel of a city, one of the true centers of normalcy in the United States, is now a wasteland.
Yeah, I visited San Francisco, 3 years ago, and as I usually do, go out for a long walk from the hotel, and that sort of homelessness and open taking of drugs damages the whole sense of what the city is about. San Francisco is having trouble as a quite lovely city with a lot of attractions, getting people to go there now, because its reputation has been damaged. Because those that were homeless, those that were drug addicts, could get better provision made for them in San Francisco than in other places, and they gravitated to San Francisco. And we were having a little bit of that same problem in Auckland, where we deal with one lot of homeless, and then, and I'm talking about K Road that you mentioned before, Chris, where some of the retailers said to me, look, we knew the old homeless people, we got on okay with them. They're gone now, but these new people that have come in to fill the vacuum, they're a different kettle of fish. We don't know them. They're less predictable. They're more of a problem. So you've got to make sure that people are attracted to the centre of a big city, or the centre of any of our big cities. You've got to make sure that provision is made for them, so that it's not just the cosmetic thing of getting rid of them, but you're actually solving the problem, not transferring it. That's the essence of it, in my view.
And so, Chris, how do you think Minister Goldsmith should be selling this? With that being said, it sounds like we're all in pretty violent agreement that there is a problem that needs to be solved. And, we're not just going to solve it by making people disappear from the spot they're in at the moment. So how do you think Minister Goldsmith should be approaching this? Do you think he should be going out there with that message, maybe showing a bit of a softer blue side? Or would you recommend just going out with a hard on homelessness, we're cleaning up the streets message?
No, I think that more is required than the punitive approach, but I do think you go back to first principles, as I said, and you talk about community having certain rights. very strong in Singapore, for example, and I happen to agree with it. But I really couldn't provide much guidance as for how Mr. Goldsmith thinks. So much legislation these days seems to be rushed through without too much thought. So if you want an insight into how Mr. Goldsmith thinks, you may need to talk to Mr. Goldsmith.
We'll see whether he wants to come on the podcast, but
I doubt it.
I'm not sure whether he will or not. We'll see what happens. But speaking of legislation that's rushed through or things that are rushed out, actually on Tuesday this week, Minister Simon Watts and the Minister for the Environment announced a raft of changes to climate legislation. I wanted to put a bit of an explainer at the front of this conversation just so we can understand what we're talking about here. But essentially, in 2019, the Climate Change Response Act Zero Carbon Amendment Bill, which is a bit of a mouthful, was passed with support from 119 out of 120 MPs. The only MP that didn't vote for it on the day was David Seymour. And it was a piece of legislation put together by James Shaw and Todd Muller. To get my head around the changes that were being proposed by Minister Watts, I spoke on Friday with Jessica Pelleray, the Executive Director of Lawyers for Climate Action. We're recording this on Sunday, just for context, but she explained to me that the main points were essentially that the emissions trading scheme is going to be unlinked from what's called the Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs, which are targets set out in the Paris Climate Agreement. And this is essentially because we've got 84 million tons of carbon that we need to do something with by 2030 if the ETS is still aligned with those NDCs. And when I say do something with, it is probably pay for, essentially. And the Zero Carbon Act will force the government to have a solution for this in its current form, or if they don't, they'll get taken to court. People will challenge the legality of not having made those plans. The other thing they did was basically blunt the Climate Change Commission's ability to provide scrutiny on government decisions, and that's been reduced significantly. So there's a very good explainer on their website, actually, the Lawyers for Climate Action, if you want to go check it out. But the thing that I wanted to talk about today, is quite aside from what's actually being announced or what was announced on Tuesday last week, is that if this is what happens 5 years after a bipartisan agreement, quite a large and sort of historic bipartisan agreement, is there any point in finding common ground on any of these big issues? I don't know, Chris, did you have a view on that? Does it seem futile to you?
Yeah, it does seem pretty futile. I mean, I know that Muller and Shaw work very hard on this, and in the background, both the Prime Minister of the day, Jacinda Ardern, and the then Leader of the Opposition, Simon Bridges, were also involved, and there were very productive discussions. And I just recall talking to Muller. He put a lot of work into it, and it was, I hate that word passionate, but he was very, very keen on seeing a positive result, as was James Shaw. And I think everyone was pretty happy with the result. And then we see it stripped away in 5 minutes. This was never broadcast when the coalition was formed. And the same thing applies to the work that Nick Smith did on water standards. There was a guy who, as Minister for the Environment, was absolutely committed to this stuff, and it meant so much to him, both the climate change and the water standards, for example. And that's being swept aside. So the answer to your question is it does really induce in me the answer, what the hell is the point? What we have is the Liberal Conservative side of the National Party swept to one side, and those who are currently stewards of the National Party with no memory for what has been in the past, most of them are careerists, are destroying the party's legacy. And of course, don't get me started on the Marine and Coastal Act, where we reached a consensus, and that was swept aside in 5 minutes as well. They've forgotten that the National Party is a Liberal and a Conservative coalition. They're betraying the Liberal principles, and they are being fundamentally unfaithful to the party that was founded in 1936. So I've got a bit away from your question, but I felt that was a point worth making.
Yeah, look, I had a good conversation with Chris Bishop about this when he was visiting London, and we both agreed that for things, and we're talking largely about infrastructure at the time, actually, for long-term projects, it's really damaging to have short-term 3-year political cycles where you reverse the process. For example, they've 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 stripped light rail out of the plans for infrastructure after a couple of $100 million had been spent on it. And I'm sure that Labor's probably been guilty of reversing things that National did in the same way. For things that have long-term impact, it really is in our national interests, small n national interests, to have a bipartisan approach. And I applaud what Todd Muller, Todd went through some hard times as leader of the opposition. I can sympathise with him on that. But it was great that he could sit down with James Shaw, and James Shaw again was a really sensible guy, Green Party leader, but was pragmatic in what he was doing, and reaching agreement over something that we need consistent and strong policy making on for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And it was incredibly disappointing for me to see that both the National Party post-election, maybe influenced by its coalition partners and by the lobby groups from agriculture and business, have stepped back from their former commitment. This is a really serious issue, and it needs both urgent action and consistent action. And we've seen bipartisanship abandoned. All of the changes that have been made under climate change, none of them have been consulted with the other parties. We've seen in this proposed legislation stripping away the agreement that the Climate Change Commission was to be an independent and impartial advisor on climate change, so that they've gutted the power of the Climate Change Commission both to give advice and also they've gutted the right of the public to be involved with making submissions, to the extent that even the first piece of legislation that's coming into Parliament fairly soon, I imagine, won't go according to urgency being taken on it to select committee, and the public won't even have the chance to make submissions on it. That is wrong in principle, and it's bad in practice. And so on both fronts, the abandonment of bipartisanship, the lack of consultation, the lack of allowing public debate and expert input, and the actual things, the changes that they're making that are gutting our response to climate change in face of overwhelming scientific evidence that this is going to damage us and the rest of the world badly, is hugely distressing. It almost seems that we're coattailing on changes that are occurring internationally, such as Trump saying, it's climate change is a hoax.
Well, and that's what I was going to ask, actually, because we do know that both the coalition partners, both ACT and New Zealand First, have come out to basically say that they would, if they were in power alone, remove us from the Paris Agreement, full stop, right? So is this another case of the tail wagging the dog, but also is this potentially a case, Chris, of the National Party caucus or the National Party ministers getting ahead of a potential bad story from the coalition partners as we go into next year?
Well, I simply don't understand why they don't take a firmer stance. Was this signalled at the time of the coalition negotiations? I don't think so. Was it part of a coalition agreement? I don't think so. Is it harmful to New Zealand's national interests? I certainly think so. And I'd be very interested in Phil's view as a former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade about our reputation. The great lie is that New Zealand's 100% pure, but there are certainly consequences in trade terms, I would have thought, Phil, if we got a reputation for being a bit fast and loose with our climate obligations.
In fact, we've got it built into our free trade agreements, both with the United Kingdom and then separately with the European Union, to the point that they can take retaliatory action against us if we are not subjecting our producers to the same sort of rules that they subject their producers to. So there are direct and negative implications for us. We have enough trouble getting agriculture into the European Union and potentially the United Kingdom anyway. And if we're seen to be really bad on climate change, when they are making the effort to try to deal with it, then their pressure groups are going to put pressure on to get retaliatory action against New Zealand. But the other thing that I just recall from London was going with Simon Watts to the City of London, to the City Financial District, and meeting with the big reinsurance companies. Now, for those that think that climate change is just a woke, wishy-washy liberal thing, they want to talk to the hardest-headed financiers in the world, those that control the huge reinsurance companies. And those companies told Simon Watts and myself that if we don't act, there'll be a huge percentage of our homes and our infrastructure that will be no longer insurable. That will create a crisis for all of those families, the families that will be affected by sea level rise, which we know is already starting to happen, that are affected by the severe weather events that are associated with climate change. Their homes will become uninsurable. When they're uninsurable, they will lose almost all of their value, and those people will be left to hang out to dry, or the rest of us will have to pay for the costs of them evacuating their homes out of increased insurance premiums that we'll be subjected to. So this is a really serious issue. I thought the debate over, the scientific evidence behind climate change being real and the imperative, the urgency of us acting to slow down and stop that process was accepted.
I used to think it was all a bit melodramatic until Cyclone Gabriel, and I will never forget the day I went to the Esk Valley, which was a true oasis 5 or 6 years ago. I've never seen anything quite like it. I mean, admittedly, they're not called the Herotama floodplains for nothing, but the damage done to the Esk Valley blew me away. And so it's a reality that we have to face, and the reinsurers will be looking at this country as a place where they have had to cough up quite a lot in recent years with earthquakes and cyclones and so on. So the point Phil makes is a very important one. You asked a question about why. I do think, generally speaking, and Phil may have a different view, but I think the farmers' vote does seem to be up for grabs at the moment. And certainly the ACT party has made inroads into it, and that Associate Minister of Agriculture, what's his name, Hoggard or something?
Andrew Hoggard, former
from
president of
Federated
Federated
Farmers. He seems to have been getting a few headlines over pork or something at the moment. But there's a real move there, and New Zealand First as well see an opening to try and get some votes from the farmers. So notwithstanding that Peters was part of a coalition that was very supportive of this in 2019, once again he's shown that past support means nothing, and he will argue vehemently why it needs to change. But I would love him to answer the question in this and in so many areas. Well, you voted for it in 2019. Why are you taking this stance now?
And Phil, on the sort of the area of policy flip flop, shall we say, Chris Hipkins is staring down a pile of policy that's been passed over the last 18 months or so, and he will be getting a lot of pressure on him internally to say, we're going to return that back to the way we had it before the national government or the coalition government. We're going to reinstate this policy. We're going to reinstate that policy. How does he, as a party leader, navigate the next 12 months of those sorts of conversations and pressure from his own party and even his potential coalition partners?
Yeah, very cautiously and carefully, I hope, and I imagine that that's what he's doing. Look, the fundamental thing that the public want from any alternative party of government is to know that they're economically competent, and they're not simply saying yes to everything and making promises that they can never deliver. So returning everything to where it was 3 years ago, given our current economic situation, won't be possible. So you've got to, therefore, politics is the language of priorities. You've got to decide what it's critical to do. But I think, from my perspective, and certainly it's the way I responded, trying to deal with climate change on council, even after COVID and the cost impact of that on council finances, this is something that you can't defer. It's not something you can say, look, we'll deal with that when we have the opportunity and the resources to do it. We're going to pay for climate change one way or the other. If we don't deal with it now and we allow the problem to get much worse, it will be less easy to remediate and much more expensive to remediate. So in sheer economic terms, we need to act now. So we're not talking simply about mitigation, but we're also talking about adaptation. And we've got to work out, what do we do? The National Party's been saying, look, some of these people might have to be on their own. Well, if you deliberately build in a floodplain, yeah, that's one thing. You've got to take a personal accountability and responsibility for it. But many of the people whose properties are now defined as floodplains bought it without having that knowledge in advance. You can't hang those people out to dry. You've got to have a national system of meeting their claims, either to adapt their property or to move them from that property. That's going to be incredibly expensive. So, it's in our interest to do what we can to mitigate, knowing that we're a small percentage of climate change impact. We need, other big countries, China, India, United States in particular, to act. But where's our persuasive power if we are not doing the same thing ourselves? As a small country, all we can do is say, we're leading by example, we're pulling our weight, now we expect you guys to do the same. And we need to call out people, such as Trump when he makes that comment. It's just nonsense. It's a lie. It's scientific rubbish. And yet, I haven't heard a single criticism of his comment from our government.
Yeah, and Chris, the leadership position, and Phil and I, as we mentioned in the first episode, are both members of the Labour Party, and the Labour Party really holds dear New Zealand's leadership position in these types of sort of policy positions internationally. We like to be able to say we are leading the world in climate change, on nuclear free, on all sorts of things. Does the National Party and does the National Party that have the same sorts of sort of prideful feelings about that sort of thing, or is it much more pragmatic in its execution?
No, I don't think we're a warm feelings party, and I don't think we proclaim those sorts of things. But we're justifiably proud, for example, or we were, of the work that we'd done in the treaty space, thanks to the late Jim Bolger and also the work of Doug Graham. And so we've got the party's had a proud tradition in many areas. It doesn't proclaim it in some kind of evangelical way, but these days, I think they seem to have forgotten all that. They've forgotten that they're heirs to a great tradition, and some ghastly, grubby little coalition agreement that they signed up in October 2023 means more than the work of Todd Muller, Nick Smith, me, Duncan McIntyre, Ralph Hannon, Jim Bolger, Doug Graham. It's all cast aside for politics, especially by people who only recently joined the party, don't know the party, are careerists, don't care for it.
And add to that list Simon Upton, because Simon Upton
Simon,
is the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment now. But yeah, I wonder, will you be able to re-establish any sort of balance, do you think, in the National Party with that the progressive liberal element, the Blue Greens, for example, in National seem to have disappeared. But where have those people gone to? Because they were people that once upon a time, we had a country where you could say, look, yeah, National might get elected this time. I don't agree with many of their policies, but they are going to do the right thing on some of the basics. I'm not sure I have that confidence now. What's happened to those people?
You're asking me questions I'm simply not qualified to answer. I do apologize.
He's pleading the fifth. Chris, do we plead the fifth in New Zealand? No, that's just an American thing,
No,
isn't
I'm not pleading the Fifth Amendment. I'm just expressing my profound disgust at the way things have gone. But Phil's absolutely right. The day after I was elected to Parliament, Judith Tizard, whom I've always liked, I've known her for many years, she phoned me and she said, "All the best, Chris. The big beasts have to agree on about 70% of the stuff and we can have a scrap on 30%. And she's absolutely right. And if you get to a stage where this sort of thing is happening, when bipartisan consensus is ripped up in the name, as I say, of a grubby little coalition agreement, then it's very bad politics. And Phil needs to get out there and talk about the visit to the reinsurer, because the consequences are serious. And he also needs to talk about, he and Tim Grosser and others, about the trade consequences of some of this stuff. This is not feel-good stuff. We've moved beyond that. It's not aspirational stuff. It's in the national interest to address these things firmly and decisively, and not retreat in the way that appears to have been happening without any consultation. 11th hour stuff slipped into the House, no proper discussion, no debate, through. And I just hope that some of the other parties in Parliament are going to stand up and say, the first thing we're going to do if we're in government is status quo ante, back to where we were, and it'll all be done before Christmas.
Yeah, I agree entirely with what Chris has said. I think, the economic arguments are as strong as the environmental arguments. You can't separate the two, actually, in dealing with climate change. This is going to have huge economic consequences for us and political consequences. I watched, I'm sorry, I keep going back to the United States. We're about to move on to that shortly. But, one of the consequences of climate change occurring will be a thing called economic and climate refugees. You've already got the people in Tuvalu that will probably move largely to Australia, but also to New Zealand, because their homes are fast becoming uninhabitable. But nothing's going to save the United States or Europe or anywhere else from the places where life will be impossible because of climate change. The dry areas that are becoming drier, the spread of the deserts, the spread of the flooding. On one hand, you've got an American president that wants to stop immigration. On the other hand, he's pursuing a policy that will make illegal immigration a greater imperative for more people for purely reasons of survival. And no matters of threat or bombing or anything else will stop them doing what they need to do to try to survive. I hope that people in the United States see that by the time of the next election.
Well, I mean, and the point is made, is not simply going to be people coming to the United States. Large parts of the United States also are severely at risk. Hurricane Katrina destroyed the reputation of G.W. Bush in 2006.
In an instant.
And it's only a matter of time before New Orleans is done over again. Trump's going to retire in Florida, and Florida has hurricane season far more frequently than it used to. So all those southeastern states are very, very much exposed. So we could ignore it, but nature is changing, and it's being felt in places as diverse as Louisiana and Florida.
Well, while we're on America, let's stay in America, actually. As Phil alluded to earlier on, we wanted to speak about the Democratic swing, should we say? The Democrats won big in America at the end of last week. Zoran Mamdani, who was running to be the mayor of New York City, won. And also Abigail Spanberger and Mikey Sherrill won their gubernatorial or governor races in Virginia and New Jersey, respectively. I guess there's a lot to unpack here, but Phil, what lessons do you think both the National and the Labour Party should be taking out of this blue swing? It was only 3 elections, although I should mention the 4th, which was the
California.
the redistricting in California. California doesn't usually have off-cycle races, but it did. And that was so that they could keep basically neutralize something that was happening in Texas in terms of winning back the House next year, or making sure they win the House next year for the Republicans. But Phil, what do you think we should be taking out of this for New Zealand politics?
Well, just to pick up your last point on what happened in California, it's about the gerrymander. One thing the American system is fundamentally broken. When the politicians decide where their boundaries go so that they can be permanently in office because they've drawn weird electorate boundaries to make sure that they have an ongoing majority, you start to undermine the whole thing of democracy. It's bizarre. It's a bit like the Electoral College and voting for the president. President should be just voted on by whoever gets the most votes directly, not through some weird system that can distort the vote. So, that distracts me from the main thing about the electoral contests. In the northeastern states, the mayoralty was different from the governorships. The 2 governors that were elected, both pretty good candidates. Mikey Sherrill as governor of New Jersey She was a female Navy helicopter pilot. Very attractive in almost every sense of the word. Sound, centrist, really good. Abigail Spanberger, also centrist, 3 terms in Congress. Both got decisive majorities. Now, the Northeast is generally a blue, meaning a Democrat area. New Jersey, however, was a state that moved more towards Trump than almost any other. And what Mikey Sherrill was able to do, I think she picked up 90% of the black vote. So the votes that had started, the black vote still went Democrat, but Trump was making good inroads into it. And the same with the Latino vote. Now, you might be a Latino that's third-generation American, but if you look Latino, you're just as likely to be asked for your ID papers by the people from the immigration division. And the Latinos are starting to feel threatened by what's happening with the crackdown on illegals. So there were 2 centrist candidates that the Democrats would like to see that replicated both in the midterm congressional elections at the end of next year and, of course, when the presidency comes up for election 2 years later. The New York mayoralty was a different kettle of fish. And gosh, you look at the Zoran and Mandani, I've got to get the M and the N right in the right place there. Pretty amazing candidate, 34 years old, the youngest mayoral candidate in a century, the first South Asian, he's actually Indian, born in Uganda, the first Muslim ever elected as mayor, and the first person, I think, that would claim to have been a democratic socialist. Now, that term would probably frighten a few people in New Zealand. It would more than terrify many more in the United States. I mean, Trump has labeled him a communist as is Trump's want. But he got a resounding vote. He got over 50% of the vote. And what's most important, he got the biggest turnout since 1969. Now, what's that? That's 50, 60 years ago. Yeah, long time. I can't even remember who was mayor then. So he did remarkably well. And why did he do well? It wasn't by being centrist. He was bold. He was a left-wing populist. So he was playing the populists at their own game. He was very clear on Palestine. He accused Israel of genocide. And yet still a third of New York's Jewish population voted for him. But he focused on what he knew that people were worried about, which is cost of living.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. Yeah, I mean, the big thing is everyone looks at him and says he's a populist candidate, and I'm going to ask Chris soon whether he's worried about the rise of populism on the left as well. But at the end of the day, he focused on cost of living issues, and that's why I think there's probably a lesson to be taken for both the National and Labor in our country. Because he concentrated on bus fares, he's concentrated on the cost of groceries, he's concentrated on rent, but only rent actually for already rent controlled apartments. So,
Yeah. Mhm.
and that's much the same way that actually the two governorship or gubernatorial races went as well. In fact, Mikey Sherrill has said the first thing that she'll do when she gets in is use the basically a state of emergency act to halt the rise of utility bills. But Chris, putting aside the fact that maybe Mamdani is central, sort of dressed up as a populist, or centrist dressed up as a populist, what do you look at that and kind of think that that is the future of politics, where the only way to beat right-wing populism is with left-wing populism?
Oh, that's a really good question, because if you're like me, a liberal conservative, it's very hard to get a headline by saying, "Oh, be careful." You get headlines by indulging in extremist language and relying on hyperbole. So maybe that is the next phase of world politics, that instead of being, you have your big centre-right parties made up of liberals and conservatives, and you've got your social democrats, you've got screaming lunatics on both sides, and I think that would be most unfortunate. But coming back to the election, yet so many New Zealanders are political junkies.
Yeah.
they love American politics, even if they don't like some of the actors. But I was just reading something that Dick Cheney said the other day, and as you know, he died a few days ago. And he said in 2000, he was looking at the electoral map with George Bush, and he remembered 1976 when Jerry Ford was president, because he was Jerry Ford's chief of staff. And basically the map had turned upside down, because if you look at who won Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, New Jersey, Virginia, Illinois, a whole lot of places, Jerry Ford did. And Jimmy Carter won the South, and it's turned completely upside down. What interested me about the result is I thought the New Jersey result would be much closer, but it was a complete wipeout. And the same applied to Virginia, which is very much for the net foreseeable future a very blue state. But the other thing I think that people miss, they were the marquee races. Down the line, the Democrats also did extremely well with a whole lot of county chairs, Supreme Court posts where they elect judges and so on. So 1 year in, I think that the Democrats may be learning that if you run the bread and butter issues and the cost of living, it's the economy stupid was the comment in 1992, they might surprise themselves. And so maybe the age of Clinton is coming back, because that's exactly the line he ran against GHW in 1992 and was very successful, and had Lloyd Benson and then, who was it, Robert Rubin as Treasury Secretary. These guys were conservative, pro-business, and were respected by those communities. And so it's going to be very interesting to watch next year, of course, as the great midterms. But if I were in the Republican Party, I'd be saying, how do we extricate ourselves from the cult of Trump and start winning back some of the principles that we used to believe in? Because on current form, I would say, looking at the results as a whole last Tuesday, they should be very troubled indeed.
I think you just managed to talk yourself around from saying that populism might be, or left-wing populism might be the on the menu of du jour today, all the way around to potentially centrist Clintonism.
Yes,
Could be. So
was
that was a bit of a journey.
It was a nice little verbal journey.
Yeah.
The answer to your question was this. Left-wing populism is as vile as right-wing populism. That's the statement of principle I made. But I was saying that, and building on what Phil said, if the Democrats are starting to elect former CIA agents or Air Force pilots, women, to these positions of gubernatorial authority, and are starting to run bread and butter issues down the line, they could surprise themselves, because I think that is the way back to political power for them.
Let's have a look at what the weakness of populism is that when you employ it, you've got to deliver on it. If you don't deliver on it, then it won't work for you. So, Mamdami's got a whole lot of things that will be really tough for him. Each of the promises he made, they were well-targeted promises, really well sold on social media, and he's got he's quite charismatic. He's got quite an enchanting nature. So he did really well. He ran a disciplined campaign, but each one of those things, the free buses, the control on rents, the opening up of the grocery stores to provide competition for food products, they're going to cost money. He's got to get the delivery right on those things. He's got to find the source of funding for those things. He's got to work around the federal punishment that might be exacted against him. Because if he doesn't deliver, then all of those people that got energized by him and came out to vote, maybe for the first time, he got 40% of the young vote, that they thought that that Trump was starting to capture the young vote, anything up to, 25 to 40. But Mamdami really, really did well in that vote. But he's created the expectation, and now he's got to deliver. And, the proof of the pudding is always going to be in the eating.
And that's the answer. if you want to destroy populism, which leads to nothing but ashes, the best way of dealing with it is to bring them into government. And that's why someone like Francois Mitterrand, who was president of France from 1981 to 1995, I think it was, he had 2 7-year terms, he brought the communists into government. And I remember Reagan and others and Thatcher were very concerned that communists were involved in the French government. But he brought them into government in order to destroy them. And he did. And so the best way of destroying populism, and probably that if Macron should think about it with Marine Le Pen, best to bring them into government, because all their hopeless rhetoric and vain promises will count for nothing. And so populism, bringing them into government so that they have to deal with day-to-day issues, is the best way of destroying them.
One of the other things, I think they're all incredibly good points, and especially good points for the New Zealand public to hear. One of the points that I wanted to bring up with you guys is often, and Chris, you mentioned earlier on that New Zealanders are political junkies. There's a lot of people that follow what's happening in America with the Democrats, with the Republicans, with Trump, and they're addicted to it. I'm probably one of those people. But
You
a lot of
both
the
are, I
time, New
can tell.
Zealanders, yeah, there you go. New Zealanders put themselves along with the perceived team based on New Zealand's political spectrum. I've got a favorite little saying that I like to say at a few Labour events, and sometimes it ruffles feathers, but John Key and Barack Obama had more in common than Barack Obama and Jacinda Ardern ever will, apart from potentially their fame in terms of their political outlook. So how do you guys see the political spectrum in New Zealand versus America? Do you guys have a view on sort of where the National Party might sit alongside the Republicans and Labour sits alongside the Democrats? Are we just a further left population here?
Well, I think the National Party is more akin to the Democratic Party than the Republican Party, and certainly the Trump Republican Party. But Chris,
Oh, no, I'd say, if you wanted to describe me, I'd say I was a northeastern Massachusetts liberal Republican. People like Bill Weld and Elliot Richardson and the former Governor Baker, who was a good fellow. They're the sorts of, I suppose, Susan Collins up in Maine, sensible New England Republicans. But basically, the problem in the United States these days is that those people don't exist anymore because the crazies have taken over the party. And also, there was always a feeling when Reagan took over that sort of Western conservatism had taken over, but Reagan wouldn't be at home in the Republican Party now. The Bushes are basically out of it now. So
Well, even Dick Cheney in the last election
Cheney
crossed
voted
across the
Kamala
floor to
Harris.
vote. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And in
So-
2000 and something, he would have been seen as the arch
Well,
Republican
he was-
that everyone on the left would.
he was the
well-
Darth Vader of the Republican Party.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and he
It's-
was.
and yeah, and the blue dog Democrats have all vanished, and they've vanished into the Republican Party. So, as I say, the fascinating thing about the United States is that it's truly dynamic. But the point I would say about I don't think there are too many lessons to take from it from a New Zealand point of view, because it's such a different political culture. But basically, I just look at it because I'm interested in it.
Well, lots to watch over the next 12 months in America anyway. As Chris mentioned, there is some midterms coming up next year, which will really decide whether Trump is a lame duck president or not. Hey, thank you guys for another episode of Cross Party Lines, and thank you to all those that are listening. Don't forget to follow the podcast, and do us a favor, share it with your friends. It's the biggest thing you can do. If you like this podcast, please share it with your friends, because that's the way people hear about podcasts. You can also follow us on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. Find us just as Cross Party Lines on those platforms. And also, we've got a Substack. Again, Cross Party Lines on Substack. Don't forget, there is a bonus episode today. It's coming out later today if you're listening to this early on Tuesday morning. And if not, we will see you next Tuesday. I'll see you guys later.
Cheers.
Goodbye.